partially for those who weren't here last time, but really not only. I think it's really important for all of us to do a quick recap. Because what we're doing, Hosea is, in some ways, Hosea is a great introduction to the notion of biblical nevuah, of biblical prophecy. And in some way, there are so many lines between Hosea and, the other Amos, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, and so on. But in other ways, Hosea really is quite unique and poses some problems that are very unique. But with those problems come, But with the uniqueness and with the real challenges of Hosea come ideas and sensibilities and messages and profundity that are really unique to Hosea. But it needs a lot of talking out. It needs a lot of thinking, and Hosea needs thinking and rethinking, and reading it and rereading it. But also, I want to say this, and it's very important, and it's hard to achieve this in a class, but I'm aspiring to this, and we all should. We all need to be his audience, right? So I can read it to you and I can teach it to you, but a nevuah, hi Susan, but these nevuot are these prophecies. I like the word nevuot better, so I'm going to use them. I'm going to use nevuah and prophecy interchangeably, but I want you to hear nevuah, right? And it's a very important distinction. Right, so I want us all to be an audience. I want us all to be reacting, because essentially that's what a nevuah is designed to be. A speech or words, let's say, an expression that we have to react to, we have to absorb, all right, each in our own way. And, so I want you to let yourself just react. It's very important, in particular it's important in any time we're talking about, I'm going to call it art, because I think all literature is art, and religious literature is art, biblical, Talmudic, all of it. So, I think we have to react to it. It's human. And I think I think art has to be analyzed, and it has to be, it needs an intellectual approach, and certainly literature does, and biblical literature does. But I think I'd argue that first, it needs a visceral reaction. Just what happened here? What's going on? What is this? That kind of reaction first, and then, of course, the intellectual, but with Hosea in particular, it's going to be intellectual / emotional analysis as well. Just a quick, I've said this so many times, but it always bears repeating, and it's short and sweet. Prophecy is a Greek word, and it implies a foretelling of the future, a predictiveness, what do the Greeks have? Like almost like oracle, like as in a feeling of like the Greek oracles. Nevuah is not. That is not. The word doesn't mean to predict something. The word means to express, right? And prophecy, nevuah. That's why I prefer to use the word nevuah or navi as opposed to prophet, because it's really a human. It's not always men, but the ones Hosea is definitely a man. Man's attempt to express who God is, to express God's will, to communicate God's message to the people. And that's a very, very challenging project, and different Nevi'im do it in different ways. And I when we read Nivuot, I think the Nevi'im communicate God's message, but they also, and this is a very important theme, they're always communicating their struggle to express it. Like, how am I expressing God's message? How am I even talking about God? How am I getting God's will, expressing that to the people? And that's part of what we hear and read when we read Nivuot. And in Hosea, that's particularly complicated. Or I would say that this is a good, maybe quick foreshadowing of what we're going to do. Hosea feels God's presence so deeply emotionally, and he has deep, I want to call it empathy for God. He intuits God so deeply, so acutely, and in fact, maybe the more a prophet feels that, the more complicated it is for him to communicate that across this chasm of experience to the people. Because, and this is another really important thing to remember, a Navi, a prophet, is not someone who achieves, intimacy and closeness with God and lives his life in a cave, right? He's not a prophet then, because if he's in a cave alone, he's not communicating to the people. And that's the essence of what a prophet is. So it's this, layered reality of intuiting God, but also being able to look at the people in front of him, the people of his generation, his contemporaries, and find some way to bridge, to bridge the gap between man and God. Okay, so Hosea, as we saw last week, Hosea, I think he's 14 chapters, and the book opens with a very, I have to say, shocking and kind of bizarre event in his own personal life, which he says God commanded him to do. We're going to read it quickly. We'll just go over quickly inside. And I was thinking today, maybe it would have been nicer, easier to read some of the other chapters first, to give you just a feeling for his maybe more normative speeches. However, I think it would be wrong to do that. And by the way, we do that with other Nevi'im. If you're teaching Yeshayahu or Yirmiyah or Amos or any of them, you don't necessarily always start with chapter 1, and you can pick and choose. You can, you don't have, you pick chapters which you think are most teachable very often. With Hosea, though, I think it's wrong to do that. I mean, these first 3 chapters where he's in this relationship with this woman are really, first of all, they're first. And the text itself says, Techilat, right? This is the first prophecy this is Hosea's first, what is it exactly? How does it express itself? I left my own text over there. The first words of Hashem to Hosea, which makes it, as I said last time, almost a little bit like an inaugural speech. But I would say even more, you can't understand the rest of Hosea without reading about these events, right? This kind of, if it was chronologically the first maybe prophetic experience that he had, then it certainly, I would say, set the tone for all of his other experiences as a Navi. And it seems just so foundational to who he is as a Navi. So let's, I'm going to share my screen so we can go right to the text. Are you seeing my WhatsApp? My Spotify? Nope.
We have it now, Emily. Oh, we just had it, I thought.
No, I don't. I want you to see Sifaria. Okay, here. This is what I want. Okay, great. Sorry. I don't know why I didn't see that. Now I can't get my actually. I want to see you guys. I don't necessarily see if I can. Okay, got it. I think this is good. I wish I could see more of you. Okay. I see Linda and Annie. All right, listen. So I think you can just yell out anything you want to. If you have questions, just speak up, unmute yourselves and speak up because we're not such a large group. Or you can send a text. You can use the chat to ask questions, or if you want to use that hands up button, you can do that. But here's what I would ask. If I'm missing someone's question, if some of you see that somebody put something in the chat or is trying to ask a question, I don't see it, somebody else, let me know so we can all do it together. Okay, give me 1 second. I want to get my text. Okay. Let's just remind ourselves this is the first chapter, but Techilat diber Adonai b'Hosea, vayomer Adonai el Hosea, lech kach lecha eshet zimunim v'yaldei zimunim ki zanot tisneh haaretz me'acharei Adonai. Okay, so God commands Hosea, and really, as I'm reading this, ask yourself questions, and also, very basic things, even about some of the ambiguity that you might notice, because it's going to be very important. And so God commands the Navi, go take yourself Eshet Zinunim. So the word Zona, you may recognize Zona as a biblical, as a prostitute. But this term is a little funky. Eshet Zinunim, I think it leaves some ambiguity. Is she a prostitute? Is she someone who had been a prostitute? Is she someone who maybe it has been suggested has maybe inclinations or towards promiscuity, but she is not, has never been a prostitute yet? It's unclear. The translation says a wife of whoredom, like it's a woman who's, it's kind of an adjective. It doesn't totally characterize her, or maybe it totally characterizes her, but it's not calling her a zona, first and foremost. In other words, so he commands the Navi to take a woman as a wife who is involved in prostitution and to have children of prostitution. And immediately God explains that this is a metaphor of some type, right? That this command that he's giving Hosea is serving as a metaphor for God's relationship with the people of Israel. So just quickly, in this metaphor, who is Hosea? And who is the woman, right? Because here, God, ki zanot tisneh haaretz me'acharei Hashem. I mean, who are, if you match up the elements of the metaphor, who's the woman there's a husband and a wife. Who are the husband and Hosea and this woman of prostitution? Who do they represent?
God and Bnei Israel.
Right. Hosea is God. Bnei Israel is this woman. And Yaldei Zenunim, perhaps it feels later on as we read the children who are, also the Jewish people, perhaps the generation that he's in or future generations, okay. So it's very clear, God spells it out. You're doing this because it's a metaphor for my relationship with the Jewish people. So, and then he proceeds, and that's going to be one very, very important question, even before we go further, and even before we explore the bizarreness of this command that God is giving him, a Navi. It's not the first time you have heard about the idea that a marriage or a loving, that God and God's relationship to the Jewish people could be represented by a loving couple. It's not the first time you've heard of it. Quickly, where else? I think we talked a little bit about this last time. Where else do we hear this? Most famously, maybe Shir HaShirim, right? But Yirmiyahu, I showed you last time, also uses it. But Hosea, it's chronologically, I think it's likely that Hosea is really the first the first one to use this metaphor very explicitly as a symbol for the relationship between God and Israel. And he certainly, Shir HaShirim expands on it and takes it very far, but he dramatizes it very powerfully and very and it's very raw for Hosea. And so I'm not ready to do this now. It's not. I think we should watch it unfold more. But it's very important to ask the question: why is this such an important, vital metaphor? I mean, to think about Shir HaShirim, Rabbi Akiva called Shir HaShirim Kodesh Kodashim, right? And this is a very explicit, harsh, it becomes violent, sexual, it's very harsh. And so it's the Navi Hosea who speaks about this. It's all the rabbis who very purposefully included this in Tanakh and then quote him and talk about this over thousands of years, right? Hosea has, we talked about audiences. Hosea has a very, very, very big fan club of people over thousands of years reading him and finding great meaning in his words and his actions. So we have to talk about that. And I want that to sort of hover in your minds. Why is this such an important way to talk about God? That's really the question, right? Why is this for the Jewish people, throughout the generations, why is this such a profoundly important way that we talk about God, that we talk about theology, I'm going to take it one step further. Keep this in mind. When you think, if you think of Jewish philosophers, who do you think of first? Who do we very typically, default to? Who's the great Jewish philosopher who talked about God, who gave us principles?
Rambam.
The Rambam, right? But Rambam happened 2,000 years later, 1,500, much, 1,500 years later, right? And until the Rambam, this was how Jewish people did philosophy. This is what it meant to be a Jewish theologian. This is what it meant to talk about God. Wow, that's kind of, powerful. I mean, there are other metaphors for God all over Tanakh too, and you know them. Mother, father, an eagle, many metaphors for God. But this is, this is a prominent and foundational way to talk about God for the Jewish people. Okay, so
Emily,
yes.
question.
Who's
Is it?
It's Robin?
It's Robin.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see me. I'm sorry, I'm cooking.
Okay.
Is it a I guess this metaphor of husband and wife that's used with our relationship with Hashem, is it in general only used when there's a concept, when we're questioning the loyalty of Bnei Israel to Hashem?
Good. I love that question. That's so important. No, I mean, Shir HaShirim, there are no questions of loyalty. There's no criticism really in Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is all love. But what Shir HaShirim does so beautifully, and I think that's one of the things that makes the metaphor so important, Shir HaShirim is like a duet of love between a young woman and a young man. And it gives us a feeling of how love includes times of great intimacy, but also times of longing and even a little bit of distance. And love is a constantly evolving relationship. So Shir HaShirim, and by the way, I think what I just said answers one of the questions about why this metaphor is so powerful. Because whereas Maimonidean philosophy, and I'm not a very good philosopher, I want to say, it expresses in very logical, rational terms, but it's kind of static, a certain logic about how we understand God and how we can't understand God, and the content of what we're supposed to believe and why it's logically true. The metaphor of love, the love relationship, expresses all the vicissitudes, all the ebbs and flows, and such a wide range of, I'm going to say emotions, but what I mean is not just emotions, but the range of what it means to be in a relationship with God, the range of experiences, that are included in having a relationship with God. And in Hosea, you're going to feel this. The harsh times, the anger and the betrayal and the brokenheartedness of God, it's very shocking to us. And it hits us very hard. God's anger at us within like that, like a husband would be at his wife's betrayal, but also you're going to see this, the depth, the compassion, the deep love, the total commitment of God to his Jewish people is the parallel to that. And I would almost say that you can't, in Hosea, the power of it is you can't have one without the other. You can't understand God's deep commitment if you don't understand how betrayed God was. And you can't understand how deep the betrayal is, how deep the feeling of betrayal is, unless you understand the depth and the absoluteness of God's love for his people. And so I think that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why the metaphor of, a loving couple is so effective and so evocative and so in such a expansive way helps us understand what belief means, what our relationship with God is. Does that help, Robin? Robin?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think also, like, I know you were questioning last week and also this week, this concept of like also the harshness of this whole concept, and even it sounds to me, at least, when there is a point in time when Hashem is addressing our loyalty to him, and he does present it in terms of a husband and wife relationship, there is like a sense of ownership almost there.
What do you mean? Say it again. Say that there isn't a sense, or there is?
There is.
Oh.
There's like a sense of ownership, and it seems like a power differential that's used,
Okay.
which the way that I see it is kind of through the prism of what relationships were then, what husband-wife relationships were then, where maybe now we would translate it more of that's like the Avinu Malkinu combination.
Yes.
But there was like a sense of serving your spouse, your husband. Is that possible?
So, yes, I think to some degree that's very, very true. Not just possible, that it's through the lens of a certain kind of society. I think I mentioned last week, my daughter told me, she referred me to some, there are some feminist like readings of the Bible. I'm not going to bring them in, but anyway, they sometimes shed light on, they sometimes open up a lens to another way of thinking about it. But in other words, they kind of sometimes try to imagine, like, could there be a nevuah where God is represented by the woman, by the wife, and it's the husband who strays? Because that's actually, a very important part of the human experience too. So it's possible to sometimes imagine that, but I think that's for another day. And I did talk about how last week we talked about how harshly it falls on our ears as women, and how like hard that was for me when I was teaching high school girls this, or attempting to, and I didn't even teach this. I taught similar passages in Yirmiyahu. It's hard, but I will point this out, Rob, and it's just exactly addressing what you're saying. Hold on. I'm scrolling down into Perek Bet. Okay, hold on. Do you see this? I'm in Perek Bet Pasuk Yud Chet. Okay, so remember, we already saw when we read Perek Aleph there, and the first few Perek Aleph and the first Pisukim of Perek Bet, you see their names, the children are given names, and then the names are changed and reversed, right? Lo Ruchama becomes Ruchama, right? Lo Ami becomes Ami. Well, take a look at this. V'haya bayom hahu meaning at the time when the God and his people will be reconciled. Here it is in the English. And in that day, do you see my cursor here? V'haya bayom hahu ne'um Adonai tikri'i ishi v'lo tikri'i li od ba'ali.
Wow.
Now that sounds very modern in a sense, but I want to remind you that, Baal is a husband, is the word used for husband biblically and rabbinically, but Baal, wait, for those of you who don't know the Hebrew so well, Baal means an owner or a master. So Baal can mean a husband, but can also be a master of a slave or a master of the house, Baal Habayit, right? It's just a word that means master. It can mean husband, which was clearly, culturally mediated. But it also, and this is very important, it also refers to what, everybody? What is Baal in Hosea's time in northern Israel?
Avodah Zarah.
Yes.
Oh,
Baal
Baal.
worship, right? Baal was the head of the
Okay.
Canaanite pantheon, right? So this pasuk has a lot of layers, but to read it again, it will be in that day, you will call me Ishi, my man, the same way that I call you Ishti, right? My man, my woman. It's to our modern ears, and why not? It feels very egalitarian, right? Rejecting the notion that a husband is the master of his wife. And I don't think Hosea was a feminist, and I don't think there's an attempt to be modern here, obviously. I think the Baal, it really is usual, but God, in other words, for God, the idea of reconciliation is for God to stop calling me, stop viewing me the way a pagan views Baal, the god Baal. Don't view me like that. It's not just stop worshiping Baal. It's also, I want you to know that my relationship with my people is not the relationship that Baal has with the people of Canaan. My relationship with my people is ish v'isha, right? We are in a relationship together. Now, let me just say this, and it's so cool that you brought this up now and you led me to this, Robin. But that's the second reason why the metaphor of a husband-wife or loving relationship between God and Israel is so powerful for Jews and for biblical Jews. Because where do we first see that we're in a relationship with God? Not a husband-wife. In the Torah, where do we see that? That we are in a relationship, and a two-way relationship with God. Where does that first happen in Torah? What is it called in Sefer Bereshit, the two-way
Is
relationship?
it Abraham?
Yes. And what
Berit.
is a berit, right? We have a covenant with God. Then it's not an egalitarian covenant necessarily, but it's a two-way relationship. That's very new to the world. That is a very revolutionary, I don't claim expertise in all ancient Middle Eastern religion, but this is a very part of the revolution of Israelite monotheism, right? That there's a brit, and it's a brit that mirrors a covenant, a contract, a two-way covenant that mirrors covenants that were prevalent all over the Middle East between people, between human kings and their people, between, I think, businesses and things like that. In other words, so from the very, very beginning, in the time of Abraham, in fact, from the outset, we meet God as a partner in a brit. Again, there's certainly a power differential, and then it's not an egalitarian. It's two totally unique partners, but there's a dependency, there's contingency. We each owe to each other. We're in a relationship from the very, very beginning. So when maybe in the time of Hosea, maybe before, when the Nevi'im start to talk about it in the framework of a husband and wife, a loving relationship like that, it's actually an extension, an echoing of that original brit. That original, very, very, very first covenantal relationship that we have with God. Right? So, and that's why this pasuk about don't call me Baal, call me Ish. No more of that. It's not just not to worship. I don't want you to think of me the way Canaanites view Baal. I don't think of you in that way. We have a I don't know why codependent comes into my mind. I don't want to say that, but a reciprocal relationship. Okay. Okay. So I would say this, since we're talking about reasons why it's so powerful, that relationship, that metaphor, I want to add one other reason, and that is that I think it keeps I think in a deep, loving relationship, ultimately, there's mystery. We can't argue logically why we love the person we love. It's not always rational. We can make a list. I love you because, I love you because, I love you because, but ultimately it's not really rational. And similarly, I think that mirrors our relationship with God. We can't really tie it up in a rational, neat package. There's mystery in both. And I think that, there are limits to any way we talk about God, but in the Maimonidean, or the way we typically read his formulation, maybe it doesn't entirely capture the mystery that we feel in our love relationships. And this metaphor in Tanakh, in the Nevi'im and Shir HaShirim, is an attempt, I think, or more accurately, captures the mystery of our relationship with God. Okay, so last time, I want to get moving a little bit. So here's, so again, something a little bit different about how I'm going to teach this is, you know me, when I teach Tanakh, I really go straight, deep into the text. But I think there are so many questions here and some very fundamental questions. I want to take a detour and talk a little bit about and show you some of the rabbinic approaches to this entire episode. Okay, so and first and foremost, and we started to touch on this last time, we were talking about I remember, Annie, you asked, how did the people react to this? How did the people feel about Hosea? And I think if I'm reading into your questions, into that question, it's yikes, this is crazy. This is what he gets up and tells the people. Hi, I'm in a relationship. I'm married to this prostitute, and I had these 3 children, and I named them fairly bizarre names. And then you'll see further, I threw her out and I say these horrible things about her to the children. And I have fantasies of stripping her naked and blah, 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 blah. But we come together, right? But we reconcile together. You can see the elements of that. You can hear what the message is supposed to be, but it's crazy to imagine a Navi getting in front of a lot of people and telling them this. And it's also crazy if what? Even maybe crazier if what? To think that God would just yell at me about this a little. How could God tell a Navi to do something so immoral, even against halacha? Because once a wife does commit adultery, he's not allowed to take her back, right? So how could God command him to do it? And how could he do it? And I think that was probably on Annie's mind a little. What happens to his audience? I mean, how do they take him seriously? And what happens to the message? Okay, so this has been difficult from, the very first readers. It's interesting, we have no idea. We said the first audience is the Navi himself. And we're going to talk more about that later. The second audience, as Linda pointed out, is this poor wife and her children. The third audience, as I think it was Lauren, and we talked about this, and this is very important, is that his speeches were not written down. They were orally transmitted. And we actually have evidence that in the generations following Hosea, and many generations following him, people were aware. We know this because his words are echoed in the books of other Nevi'im. But remember, everything is pretty oral at this time. And maybe I shouldn't say that completely. We know that there were people transcribing the speeches of the prophets, but a lot of the transmission was oral. But there's a certain point where this is committed to writing and committed to a certain format, and it becomes part of Tanakh. So some of the earliest, actually, I didn't include this because so the first, so what we're going to learn now, we're going to look at Pesachim, the Gemara Pesachim. But even before I do that is, because really even probably before, no, for sure before the Gemara, the Targum Yonatan, which I think is kind of an early Targum. A Targum means a translation / interpretation of Tanakh into Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of, all the Jewish people at the time. And it was actually, and there was even a practice of in early synagogues to read the Torah and have a maturgaman, a person next to the Koreh, explaining it in Aramaic. So as with every translation, it kind of slips into interpretation. It's not an exact translation. And in terms of these chapters of Hosea, the Targum, it's not on my sheet. I can show it to you next time. The Targum immediately presents Hosea's story as a metaphor. So it doesn't even say Hosea took a wife and he had children and he changed their names. In the Targum, it goes straight to Israel betrayed God. I'm simplifying this, but Israel betrayed God and this is what happened. So the Targum doesn't even consider that this is something that, we assume the Targum, he doesn't want to present this as something that, as an incident in Hosea's life that actually happened, that there really was a wife and children, and that he goes right to the metaphor, right? As if the incident never happened, okay? And that is one approach. And do we understand why? It was, I don't know, embarrassing, almost shameful. It was saying, and I'm going to say it wasn't just because he wanted to censor Hosea. He couldn't fathom it himself for the reasons that we spoke about before. However, in the Gemara, and this is, the rabbinic layer, the Talmudic, early, early commentary on the Torah, but Gemara is not a commentary on Torah, right? I just want to give everybody context. Rashi has a commentary, line by line, pasuk by pasuk, on the Torah. Ramban does, Ibn Ezra does. The Gemara is Talmud, it's Talmud, but all over the Talmud, we hear approaches or commentary on various parts of Tanakh. And here we go. And I actually apologize. I should know the context to this Gemara, but I don't. Okay. I'll find that for you next week because it's probably very interesting. Okay, so this is in the tractate Pesachim. It's about Pesach. I'll read the Hebrew, or this is Hebrew, and you will read the English, and we'll talk about it. Amar lo hakadosh baruch hu leHosea. God said to Hosea, Banecha chatu. V'haya lo lomar, Banecha hem b'nei chinunecha. One second. Right. So God comes to Hosea and says, as the rabbis are imagining this is what happens between gods and Nevi'im. God comes to the Navi and says, hey, your people, that idea, your people, your kids, when the husband says your kids and my kids, your kids, okay. Your people have been sinning and, you got to do something about it, or we have to do something, whatever. But Hayalo Lomar, Hosea should have said, Banechahem, they are your children, reminding God, they're not just people, they're your children. You're in a relationship with them. In this here, you're their father. Haim, b'nei chinunecha, they're the sons of your beloved ones. Okay, yes, b'nei chinunecha. Haim b'nei Avraham, Yitzchak v'Yaakov, galgel rachamecha alehem. So, okay. So the rabbis are saying, when God approached Hosea saying, your children are sins, Hosea was supposed to do what? essentially. He was supposed to defend the people. He was supposed to say, my children, no, they're the children they're your beloved children, the children of your beloveds, evoking the forefathers. You, galgel rachamecha alehem. And Hosea should have defended them, and he should have begged for God to have mercy on them. Lo dayo shelo amar kach. And it's not bad enough that he didn't enter a plea for them. Ella amar lefanav. But even worse, Hosea said to God, Ribono shel olam, kol ha'olam shelcha. Kol ha'olam shelcha hu. Ha'aviram b'duma be'uma acheret. Instead, Hosea said to God, what do you want? You're the master of the whole world. Switch them out, return them to the story, the Jewish people, and find another nation to love. And by the way, there's such a funny, there's an interesting passage in Amos that almost could relate to this for another time. So God is not happy with Amos's response. What does God expect the prophet to do? And it's not an easy thing. Someone say this, tell me, what does a prophet need to do? And we see this in Moshe's lifetime, in all of them. What is
Defend the people.
defend the people? Exactly.
Defend.
As much as the prophet needs to be so deeply connected to God that the prophet can almost empathize with God, and so clear-eyed about the Jewish people that he can see their sins acutely. At the same time, to be a prophet means to be expected to be in a constant state of compassion for the people and defend the people before God. So God isn't happy. He says, what should I do with this old man? Omarlo, God hatches a plan. I will tell him. And here is quoting the second pasuk of Hosea. Lech bekach isha zona. Go take ish. He calls it the Tanakh doesn't quote it. The Gemara doesn't quote it exactly. Take for yourself a prostitute and have children of prostitution with her. And v'achar kach omarlo. And then I'm going to tell him, throw her out. Me'al panecha, shilcha me'al panecha. Imhu yachol l'shloach, af ani eshlachet Yisrael. So God hatches his plan, which is essentially what I'm going to tell Hosea. If you can't find compassion for the people, if you can't defend the people before me, then I am going to put you in the same emotional position that I find myself in. I'm going to tell you, go marry a prostitute meaning an imperfect wife, right? Just as I took the Jewish people with all their imperfections and all of their potential to stray from me, and have children, 3 children who you love with her. And then I'm going to tell you, divorce her, throw her and the children out. If you can bring yourself, if Hosea can bring himself to do that, okay, I'll throw out the Jewish people, as he said. Continuing. After 2 sons and 1 daughter had been born for him, Amarlo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God came and said to Hosea, Lo haya lecha lilmod mi Moshe Rabbecha, shekevan shedibarti imo pereish min ha'isha. Now that's a very interesting line. God, almost like, I'm not finding the right word, like baits him a little bit. Hosea, why aren't you throwing, your wife out? Why aren't you getting rid of her after she has strayed? Even Moshe separated from his wife. Now that's kind of, maybe we'll talk about that next time a little bit, because that's a difficult example to bring up, but he's almost, God almost is a little bit egging him on a little bit. And at that point, Hosea says, Amarlo Amar lo, Hosea says, Ribono shel olam, yesh li banim mimena, ein ani yachol lahotziah v'lo legarsha. How can I throw her out? How can I divorce her? I have children with her. Amar le hakadosh baruch hu, uma ata sheishtecha zona, ubanecha b'nei zinunim, ve'en ata yodea im shachahem. You married a prostitute. You have children with her. You don't even know who their father was, if they're your own children. Kach Yisrael. So Israel, the people of Israel, Shehen b'nei Abraham, b'nei b'chunai, b'nei Abraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, echad me'arba'a kinyanim shekaniti ba'olam. One of the four, what do they call it? Acquisitions that I acquired in my world. That's for another discussion. Okay, this is about this. Okay. So anyway, so according to the Gemara, what did the Gemara just do? For two things, two really important, I mean, a lot of things. So first and foremost, no, not first and foremost, I'm sorry. The Gemara just provided a backstory, right? The Gemara, the rabbis in the Gemara weren't willing to accept at face value that God just told Hosea to take this wife and throw her out, but that he had a reason to do it, right? That and not only that, but the lesson was what this whole episode was designed to express or to teach was who is supposed to learn from this episode. This isn't in the rabbinic Hosea, no, right? Because in this rabbinic story, we don't even hear about the people that he's talking to. It focuses entirely on Hosea himself, right? So, and I think that so they first of all they can't accept the story at face value, but at the same time, in this rabbinic Talmudic retelling of the story, it seems to actually happen, right? Right? As opposed to the Targum that can't even bring himself to translate word for word the words of the Tanakh because he can't even bring himself to think that it actually happened, okay? The rabbis, number one, assume that, or were comfortable talking as if it actually happened. God told Hosea to take a wife who's a prostitute, have children, and then throw them out. So the Gemara makes that assumption. It provides a backstory to it, but the backstory actually, and that's one of the reasons I think the rabbis too saw this episode almost as a hakdasha, almost as an inaugural moment in the life of Hosea, the moment that maybe sent him out into being a prophet, because it was almost as if God said, I have to teach this guy. He's not ready to be a prophet until I can actually teach him this lesson, that to be a prophet is to have this constant dual allegiance, to have this constant total empathy for both God and for the Jewish people. And that's the lesson, right? The lesson, and so it's a lesson for the rabbis in this Gemara. The lesson, the important message, and kind of back to Robin's question, the important messaging isn't about the punishment or the harshness. The central messaging is, in the end, no matter how terrible they are, even though I'm representing the Jewish people as a prostitute, even so, ultimately, it's my love for the Jewish people that is primary, that overcomes, it's the central, it's the underlying assumption to everything. And it's almost as if God wants to make sure that Hosea, before he goes out into his career as a prophet, understands that very, very deeply. Now, I just want to give you, to give you a little taste of what comes next, and then, we'll look at these next week. This is not comfortable for all the rabbis. And I'm going to just show you the Rambam for a minute, only because I have the Rambam translated here, but he's only one of a few. Chalila le'elokim mitei nevi'im domim l'shotim u'l'shikorim v'yatsum v'yitzavem la'asot ma'aseh hashigayon. God forbid to assume. He's not only talking about Hosea, this is from Moreh Nevuchim. He's not just talking about Hosea, he's talking about other episodes in Tanakh where Tanakh says God commanded a Navi to do a symbolic act, to perform a Nevuah. And Maimonides says every time something like this happens, it is done in a prophetic, oh no, I'm losing it. No. It's done, here we go. Every time this happens, every time in Tanakh where it says that God tells a prophet to perform some very often very strange behaviors, we must bear in mind Ezekiel, Isaiah, many of them. Let me just see it very clear. The same applies to the account of the commandment given to Hosea, taken to thee a wife of boredom and children, and to the birth of the children and giving the names to them. All of this past happened in a prophetic vision. When one stated that these are allegories, there's no doubt that the events related had no existence. In other words, Hosea's marriage to this woman and the children and the divorce had no existence except in the minds of those whom the prophet says, except in the minds of those whom, right, okay. And he goes on to say that the prophet, it's so obvious that these events could not have happened in real life, that they happened in prophetic visions. It's so obvious that the Tanakh doesn't even have to explain that the Tanakh doesn't even need to qualify. There are sometimes that it'll say, B'mar'eh Hashem. It'll be specific that a prophet had a certain vision or or saw God, something like that, in a vision. But the Rambam, Maimonides, and Moreh Nevuchim is so absolutely clear that these things could never have happened, and that it has to be in a prophetic vision, in a dream or some imaginary, vision, that he says Tanakh doesn't even have to qualify it on the spot. Okay, so too, what we just read sort of expresses the three approaches. There's another, I'd say there are three basic approaches. One is the Targum, and he's kind of unique in this, I think, but closer to the Maimonides. It didn't happen in real life, and the only important thing is the metaphor, right? The Rambam is saying it didn't happen in real life, but the fact that it happened in a vision is important. So the Rambam is not, eliminating the metaphor. And in fact, I want to point out that the Rambam is not minimizing the experiential impact of the marriage and the children and the divorce and so on. I guess he is minimizing it somewhat. He's saying that it happened in a dream. And by the way, I don't know if any of you can relate to that. When we have dreams, they feel very real. And we can wake up from a dream if we wake up in the middle of it and we can hold on to it. It can have great meaning in our lives. And the emotions that we feel in a dream state, they can inform us, they can change us. they can, I don't know, they're, you know, they're not, it's not totally inconsequential. He's not denying the experiential power of, you know, God's command to Hosea. He just can't accept that it could happen in real life. The Gemara, which is interesting, the earliest, amongst the earliest layer of, rabbinic rabbis talking about this, the Gemara wants to see it as something that happens in real life, but it gives it a very interesting and very important backstory of what it meant. But it is really interesting because in the Talmudic story, and by the way, in the Tanakh too, it seems to be between God and Hosea. We haven't heard, and I don't want to make this too, I don't want to put too much weight, give this too much weight. Sometimes in Tanakh, it'll say a Navi went into the Beit HaMikdash or to a palace or to the streets or whatever, and he delivered a prophecy there. We don't have that feeling in this chapter. It's almost, the chapter is written and it almost, as it seems almost to feel like it was an event between the prophet and the Navi and Hashem. Let's pick that up next time. But that's where, remember, if you remember, I do put a lot of weight on the idea of the Navi himself, the prophet himself, being the first audience, right? And yeah, so let's end here. Any questions? Let me get rid of my sharing. I have to figure out how to see you better. Hi, everybody. Any questions? Hi, Sheba.
I'd like to say that this exchange in the Gemara between Hashem and Hosea is so human. I see the rabbis,
Yes.
Like Hosea said, well, find someone else. Like
it's so human. Yes.
It's so human, right? It really makes the Gemara come alive for me and not just a tomb of,
It's so true. It's so true.
Emily,
Yes.
I missed the first few minutes, so I apologize. But did you say anything about Hashem being the father and Bnei Israel being the son? Or the
yes.
child?
Only really appears, I mean, in our class today, that
Yes.
appeared in the Gemara. But it doesn't, later on in Hosea, God is a mother even. But at this, right,
At this juncture.
at this moment, it's entirely about husband and wife.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Emily.
giving the class.
So nice to see all of you. And I'm kind of
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Tanakh, but Annie, you brought me back a little to the Talmudic stories that we've been doing.
Yes, I love that, Emily.
and I
Yes,
like that, yeah. So I gave you one Talmudic story today too.
right.
It was a good one.
And you get a feeling of the rabbis reacting to Tanakh, which is also very,
Interesting. Yeah. Right.
yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Emily.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Emily. Bye-bye.